I'm Tom Wilson, and I want to thank all of you for coming. It's really been very moving for me, for my wife Charlie, the support that you've given our family, and especially Nancy and Jim's girls and colleagues, and Nancy's girls as well. I want to keep my remarks fairly brief, but you may learn some things about Jim that he would be unlikely to have talked about. We had a very unusual upbringing, and it really was a walk with brothers. And the walk began in 1942 when I was born at the Naval Air Station down the road in Pensacola, Florida. Shortly after that, my dad, who was in the Navy at the time, was transferred to California, where he was, as I understand it, training with Marines at Fort Ord, and we rented a house somehow on the one of the fairways of Pebble Beach Golf Course. As far as I know, this was Jim's first introduction to the game of golf. For those of you who knew him, you knew how passionate he was about it and how good he was at it. And I am told, I was too young to know at the time, that he had a habit of going out onto the fairway, because apparently the drives went over this hunk of land where our house could not be seen from the tee, and appropriate the golf balls that were hit there from time to time. And then with great amusement, he would sit there and giggle when these guys would come up looking for their balls, unable to find them, completely mystified as to what happened to them. But that was Jim's introduction to golf. After California, my dad was sent to the language school at Arlington Hall. He was a naval intelligence officer. And it was at that time that the Navy expected that the war would likely continue to 48. There were Nazis and others that were escaping to South America. And the Navy trained up officers who were language proficient, my dad being one of them. And he became a fluent Spanish speaker. After the Navy, in 1946, he was riffed from the Navy, and something he never forgave the United States Navy for, because he loved the Navy. But he made a graceful segue into the State Department. And appropriately, his first assignment was Madrid, Spain. Jim was 8 years old at the time, and I was 6. And we go to Madrid, which was at the time kind of a third world country, really, because it had been cut off from the rest of Europe by the loose affiliation with the Axis powers brought out of Berlin. And it was at that time that the U.S. government reestablished diplomatic relations with Spain. And my father was involved in acquiring the land on which the embassy, which sits there today, on Calle Serrano, was placed. And we, of course, were dumped into this culture. There were no Americans over there, no American kids, not that I was aware of. I don't think I met a single American kid in the embassy or anything like that. It was just me and my brother. And we were struggling to learn this strange language. And it was kindly stated in Jim's obituary that he learned Spanish on the playgrounds of Madrid. The truth is, it was more like the streets, if you know what I mean. And I remember one incident vividly when Jim and I were together, and we decided that we had learned certain Spanish words from some of our friends on the street. And we decided we'd try those words out on this lady who was standing there sweeping her front lawn. And I remember Jim said something to her. I don't remember what it was, but she became red in the face, and she picked up the broom at a high port arms and started chasing us, and we knew we were in big trouble. So we ran home and hid from her, and nothing else came from it. But that was kind of a halting beginning to our introduction to a new culture. We went to a school there called Maravillas, Christian Brothers, very disciplined, hard-nosed, steely-eyed monks. And that was really a great blessing, because we learned to speak Spanish and we learned the culture, and we learned it. We learned both very well. One of the things that I do remember vividly is my dad, I think out of a sense of obligation more than anything else, to share with us the culture of Spain, took Jim and I to a bullfight. And as I recall, there were 7 bulls. We got through 5, and I had had enough. And I don't remember exactly Jim's reaction, but what caused me to say that I've had enough is when one of the bulls, no, true story, got out of the ring, he crashed through the boards that comprised the verges of the ring, and he's up in the stands with, spectators scattering here and there, and of course these intrepid young Spaniards taking off their coats and to get them out of the stands. I was horrified by it. I never wanted to see another bullfight as long as I lived. But what a wrenching introduction it was for me. I think I was 7 years old at the time. Thereafter, Dad got sent to London, to Grosvenor Square, and we lived at a place in Hampstead Heath, and 81 Reddington Road. And the truth of the matter is, Jim and I were living like the Rothschilds without the money, because the dollar after World War II was hugely valuable. My dad was on a government salary with whatever extras they gave for being overseas, and we lived very well. At the end of our street was Hampstead Heath, which was a natural overgrown wood in London. And it's been preserved, I assume, and it was a wonderful place to go fantasize about Robin Hood and knights in shining armor and all of that. And of course, my companion throughout those experiences was my brother Jim. During that time, my father and mother began attending church at the Farm Street Parish, which was a Jesuit parish in downtown London. They befriended 2 Jesuits, Father Christie and Father Mills, and they shared with these kind priests the fact that if we send these boys to Sweden and they have to learn Swedish before they can learn academics, they're going to be functional illiterates. This is not good. So these priests intervened with some of their fellow priests up at a place called Stonyhurst in northern England, and that's how we came to go there. And we spent 3 years going to boarding school at Stonyhurst, traveling back and forth between Stockholm and London and northern England and Lancashire to go to school. I remember one of those voyages, Jim was always in charge of me, himself and me, and because I was young, 10, 11 years old at the time. And one time we were shipped across the North Sea, and it was winter time. I do not recommend that any of you do that. It was tough. The ship, we could feel the screws of the ship coming out of the water, these huge 30, 40-foot waves in the North Sea. And of course, I was sick as a dog. Jim was apparently impervious to seasickness, which of course made me admire him all the more and see him as being 10 feet tall, for sure. Up at Stonyhurst, we had a thing called Brothers Walks. Jim was in another part of the school. It was a very large campus out in the middle of the beautiful rolling countryside of northern England. And we would go on these long Brothers Walks, which were very much encouraged by the folks at Stonyhurst. And it was an extremely imposing place. As I say, I think the only way that it survived the Reformation is Queen Elizabeth didn't know exactly where it was and couldn't get there. But these were very, very steely-eyed Jesuits and wonderful pedagogues. They were really serious about raising up, teaching young boys about life, and there wasn't a lot of cuddles in the place, I'll tell you that. To give you an idea of the kind of severity that both Jim and I experienced, the kind of people they built, I have some friends who went to Oxford and Cambridge in England, in Washington, D.C., and I tell them, you have Eton and Harrow, but the Catholics have Ampleforth and Stonyhurst. And Stonyhurst can make a boast that not even Eton can rival. They always look at me and they say, "Oh, Tom, what could that be?" And I tell them, The first winners of the Victoria Cross, the highest award for military gallantry, in each one of the great wars of the last century. Stonyhurst Old Boys, Roman Catholics giving it up for king and country. And every time I get the same reaction, "Oh, Tom, that is impressive." But Stonyhurst was a wonderful place. It gave us an appreciation and a love of language, and probably that's why both of us ended up being lawyers. We came back to the States after that, went to a place called LaSalle Military Academy in Long Island, New York. And that's when Jim discovered that he was a terrific long-distance runner. When he was a freshman in high school, he ran a 4:21 mile. And this was very shortly after Roger Bannister had broken the 4-minute mile. So a 4:21 mile was pretty impressive. He also ran cross country at a place called Van Cortlandt Park, and that year ended up being number 2 in the city of New York. No small accomplishment in that big city, I will tell you. He was a terrific runner. And of course, I continued to live in his shadow. We came back to DC for a while, and then my dad got transferred to Havana, Cuba. In August of 1958, we showed up in Havana. Shimmering sunlight, palm trees, wonderful weather, and my dad had just purchased for us a brand new 1958 Chevrolet Impala convertible with a Continental kit in the back. Let me tell you, the girls were gorgeous and it was wonderful. That was the good news. The bad news was there was a lot of political upheaval and turmoil at the time in Havana, throughout Cuba. And there was an organization called the Servicio de Inteligencia Militar, their military police. These guys rode around in Oldsmobiles, painted dark brown, with 3 people in the car, and in between the front seat and the back seat, a rear view mirror that's this big, with a soldier in the back with a Tommy gun across the seat. And they would use that automatic weapon in a heartbeat if they had to. One night I was asleep. We had rooms separated by a bathroom, and we lived overlooking the Malecon Drive in Havana, which is along the seashore. We could see Morro Castle every day, and the light of Morro Castle, ships going in and out of Havana Harbor. It was really beautiful. And between us and the United States Embassy, which was literally a full block away, that's all, in between was a police station. I was awakened to shattering gunfire. This was around October of 1958. And I ran over to Jim's room and we looked out the window. And on the front walk of the police station, apparently what had happened, they were leading 2 guys into the police station. One of them broke and ran one way, and the guards went after him. The other guy, being now unguarded, went the other way. They just turned around and shot him right there on the machine gun on the sidewalk. I got there when the bucket and mop were being applied to what was left of this poor soul. At another time, shortly after the revolution, Castro came in January 1 of 1959. My dad was at the embassy 24/7. He slept at the embassy because of his duties there to make sure if the embassy were attacked that none of the codes would fall into the wrong hands. And my dad was nothing if he was not a very diligent public servant. He decided after we'd been pulled up, my mother, my father, my brother, myself, and my dad's mother, Flossie Delia Graves Wilson from Meridian, Mississippi. Grand old lady, she was wonderful. Dad decided it was time to get us out of the apartment, so we went down to the Valhalla Hotel down in further downtown Havana. He knew the maitre d' at this hotel. Very good, very nice restaurant. I can remember it clearly to this day. Walk in, the desk is on the right. To the left is the entrance to the dining room, which was in the back. In front of that were all these palm trees and planters and all marble floors. And really a very cool, welcoming kind of place. We walked into the dining room and there were no other civilians in the dining room except ourselves, the five of us. There were about 35 Babulos who were in there, who just come out of the hills and secured Havana for Fidel. Those of you who remember the particulars of history, Fidel didn't come to Havana right away, the capital, but he rode there on various vehicles all the way through the Long Island of Cuba, 680 miles away it was. So he didn't get there till later. We're sitting there in a bank right around the door. It was my father, myself, my brother, my grandmother, my mother. And all of a sudden, some of these Batistianos, Fulgencio Batista types, Batista had fled on January. He looted the treasury, suitcases full of money, put them on airplanes, flew to Miami. So there was nobody there except these Babulos to keep order in the city of Havana. Some of these dead-enders from Batista came by and machine gunned the front of a hotel. And we hear these pots exploding, bullets hitting walls, glass shattering all over the place. And being a very correct American diplomatic family and wanting to make the right impression on people in a foreign country where we were stationed, we were very sensitive about that, and we looked at that to determine what the appropriate diplomatic etiquette is when in a foreign city and fired on with automatic fire. And he just kept eating dinner. I guess it was World War II, the Navy thing or whatever. He didn't move, so we did the same thing. After the meal was over, we went out and got the car. We're driving away. I looked down the street, and here's a body hanging out of a car. The Babulos had grabbed their weapons, gone out, had a gunfight, and come back in, put their weapons back over their chairs, and went back to their arroz con pollo, And it was an amazing experience. We get in the car and drive away. The first one to speak was my grandmother. She said, "Ian, that was most interesting." To say the least. Anyway, after Jim left Cuba and went to Georgetown in August of 1959, and I followed him there in June of 1960. And we saw one another while at Georgetown, but we didn't hang out together. And we embarked upon our adult lives. We both went in the military. Jim did the Navy, I did the Army, and became lawyers and started our families and so forth. And we started to grow apart. And we ended up, somewhat surprising, I think, to me, having very different worldviews. And that kind of separated us, and it was, I think, painful for both of us. But Jim was always there for me, and I always tried to be there for him, even in times when we didn't completely agree about important things. One thing I will say, Jim loved his family intensely. He loved his girls, Tiffany, Courtney, and Mary Elizabeth. He loved Nancy's girls, Polly, and Kelly, and Laura. And when they started having their families, he loved all of them too. Jim was good at family, and I learned a lot from him in that regard, and I'm grateful to him for that. This thing about death is, it's very difficult. It's difficult for everyone who experiences losing a loved one, and especially someone who was as close as Jim and I were as brothers. But I think it's important for all of us to remember that it's all right to grieve. It's necessary to grieve. We should grieve. The shortest verse in the Bible is Jesus wept. That's John 11:35. He also said that he was going to provide a place, to prepare a place for his disciples. And, that is a place when my time comes where I hope I go, meet Jim, and continue our walk as brothers. Thanks for being here.
2 years ago, Dad turned 70. We had a big party, music, food, laughter, and dear friends. And we took the opportunity to share with it those things for which we were extremely grateful. I'm so thankful I had a formal moment to share these thoughts with Dad, for they have had a great impact on my life, as well as the lives of my sisters. However, before I do that, I want to take a moment to share my immense gratitude, respect, and admiration for Nancy. As my stepmother, Nancy has become a great friend over the past 20 years. Thank you for being such an amazing wife, caregiver, and friend to my dad over this difficult year. You've remained a consistent, positive influence in Dad's life, and a ray of sunshine for our family, and I will always appreciate that. Thank you. A few words about my sweet dad. To my sweet dad. Thank you for the gift of education. In our family, education was a huge deal. I never knew that we had the option of not going to college, and graduate school was not an unattainable goal. Expectations were high, and we certainly did not want to disappoint. Dad's focus on education has served us well, and we are forever grateful for that gift. Thank you for the gift of travel. We had the opportunity to grow up in this small, wonderful community of Ocean Springs. Yet we had two parents who were world travelers. We grew up listening to Dad's wonderful stories about living as a young boy in Madrid, attending Stonyhurst, and graduating from high school in Cuba. Dad put us on an airplane at very young ages, even traveling by ourselves to California, Washington, D.C., and England. He always encouraged us to learn, explore, and experience the world around us. He always said travel and education, as well as the friends we made along the way, these experiences, as opposed to material things, were the true stuff of life, something no one could ever take from us. Hurricane Katrina drove this point home, when every material thing he had was taken away. Even when our photographs from some of those experiences were taken away, we still had them. We still had what they made us. Thank you for the gift of work ethic. Dad started us working at his law office at a very young age. If you wanted something, you had to earn it. Summers and school jobs were always expected, and some things we just had to pay for ourselves if we wanted it. There was never an assumption that we would just be given anything extra. We may have complained a whole lot back then, but like so many life lessons Dad taught us, the strong work ethic in our family has been a tremendous asset to all of us. Thank you for the gift of music. From Friday night living room dance parties to albums such as Saturday Night Fever, ABBA, Olivia Newton-John, and the laid-back tunes of John Denver, Simon and Garfunkel, and Barbra Streisand, Sunday morning opera, and classical music, our house was always filled with music. As kids, Dad took us regularly to the Mobile Opera, Coast Symphonies, and various ballets and musicals from Mobile to New Orleans, and even Annie on Broadway. We are so thankful for the opportunity to grow up surrounded by art and music. Thank you for the gift of encouragement. This applies not only to his daughters, but his daughters' friends and all around him as well. He had an ability to see our strengths and true desires and encourage us to hone those. The best example when a friend of Court's was about to take a job at Bank of America when all she really wanted to do was be a writer. His encouragement for her to pursue writing led her to the New Yorker, the New York Times, the Daily Beast, and a couple of years ago she published her first book. This is just one of the many successful alternative paths he encouraged along the way. Thank you for the gift of good food. White gloves and party manners, isn't that what they used to call it? We Wilson girls never attended those classes, but Dad started dressing us up and taking us out for fancy dinners at a pretty young age, schooling us at Trilby's and Mary Mahoney's that not every restaurant served hamburgers and fries. Old-fashioned manners were never to be ignored. He actually made us eat filet mignon and baked potatoes. However, as we got older, we think he perhaps regretted the early exposure to fine dining, as his little princesses developed fancy palates. What do you mean there's no filet? I remember him coming to, when I was in school in God, where'd you get this expensive taste? Thank you for the gift of your presence at every major life event and every little one, even when it involves 15 hours of dreaded, uncomfortable plane travel. He always made sure he was there. Finally, we would like to thank Dad for the gift of golf, but surprisingly, we Wilson girls never developed Dad's love of golf. Unless you count the endless fun of driving the golf cart as little girls, once we pulled out of the side of the clubhouse, practicing our putts and consuming tons of hot dogs, Cokes, and Hershey's bars at the 19th hole, which was awesome, by the way, and a source of many fond memories. So we take that back. We thank Dad for the gift of golf. So for all my dad accomplished in his life, from his world travels, education, Dad's entrepreneurial spirit, his optimism, and for the ways that he strived to improve the lives of others, we are so proud that he was our dad. We miss you, and we love you, and we'll continue to work hard to make you proud.
Thank you, Tiffany, and regarding your sentiments about Nancy, thank you, Nancy. I agree 100%. In the process of writing my dad's obituary, I took a look at his Kindle to see what he'd been reading over the past few months. I expected a diverse selection, and he didn't disappoint. Here's the short list. David Brooks, The Social Animal, the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, better known as Obamacare. Yep, the actual text. Faulkner's A Rose for Emily and Other Stories, Anna Karenina, the complete Mark Twain collection, Gulliver's Travels, Thomas Aquinas, Summa Theologica, the Holy Bible. This was Dad. He was constantly exploring, on an endless search to find the best answers to political questions, to understand the struggles of the human condition, and the different ways we all cope with such struggles. To him, these themes had to be explored together because how we view these struggles and how we cope with them often fuels our politics. And what this list said to me was that despite that in his later years, he became increasingly frustrated as a progressive in Mississippi. So much so I used to tease him that he sounded like a little curmudgeon in his responses. This book list told me that his mind and his heart were still, as always, open. He understood that fallible, imperfect, storyful nature called the human condition because his own life was so full of struggles and imperfections. As such, he knew that privilege doesn't shield us from it. He knew that if it was difficult for him, it had to be that much more for those. We were all 18, and we had all of them, of course. He told a story. He told a story of being in the room when with a friend as he was dying. Much like my dad, his friend's personality shone through up until the very last days. And after he saw his friend take his last breaths, he looked at him and said, "Where did you go? Where did you go?"
Strange waking up this morning, stumbling out to the living room, and not finding Jim in his big red reclining chair, his beautiful gray hair sticking up in all directions in bedhead style, newspapers strewn all around him, the news playing softly in front of him on the television. Jim Wilson, my stepfather for 20 years, was a voracious reader, constantly seeking knowledge and always eager to learn more. He bestowed his love of learning in his girls. What a beautiful gift. Jim was an intellect, a world traveler, a lover of classical music, and an obsessed lover of golf, both as a player and as a spectator. I'm going to differ a little bit from Tiffany here when I say that Jim's culinary preferences did not match his otherwise sophisticated ways. Jim preferred a hot dog or a peanut butter and jelly sandwich over a fancy 5-course meal any day. Although we teased him incessantly about his eating habits, it was a Jimism that made Jim Jim. Jim never took himself too seriously, and he had an amazing sense of humor. I wonder if that was a disposition acquired out of necessity, because he was constantly surrounded by women. 3 daughters, 3 stepdaughters, a work staff largely comprised of women, a wife. Was it a coping mechanism, or simply his God-given personality? Regardless, I admire that quality about Jim. One day, while much of the family was living in the Washington, D.C. area, Jim announced very publicly that he was going to start exercising and eat more healthily. Neither of which interested him in the slightest, but I guess, like all of us, guilt got the best of him. A couple of days later, we all met for lunch at one of his favorite eateries, Julio's in downtown D.C. It was a beautiful early summer day in Washington. Blue skies, cherry blossoms in bloom. Julio's had a beautiful rooftop deck, and the restaurant was known for their delicious, thick crust pizzas, brimming with cheese and the toppings of your choice. Jim, keeping to his word, showed up on a bicycle. He had actually cycled to the restaurant from his brother Tom's house. Very impressive indeed, a sign that he was serious about his commitment to healthy living. As we sat on the rooftop deck enjoying each other's company and the beauty of the day, we could not help but notice the diners all around us, delighting in the warm, crunchy yumminess of the pizza, almost as if exaggerated to test Jim's commitment. When the waiter came around to take the order, all eyes were on Jim. The waiter approached him and asked, "And what would you like to order, sir?" Jim looked up from his menu with an almost defeated, angry look on his face. And he said, "I'll have a tuna tango." The entire table roared with laughter. We all knew it was the last thing Jim wanted to eat. But in typical Jim form, quintessential sideways Jim smile spread across his face as he joined in the laughter, finding the humor in the situation. He was an amazing sport. From that day on, Jim was often offered a tuna tango, to which he would say, "Ha, ha, ha," or, "No, thank you." We got a lot of mileage from that one. Jim was a great father. He and his girl shared a beautiful, close father-daughter relationship. Jim beamed with pride of their many accomplishments and the women they turned out to be. He had an overwhelming amount of love and respect for them all. I have no doubt that he considered them his biggest accomplishment in life. There are so many things I loved about Jim, but the thing that I loved and appreciated most about Jim was the way that he loved and adored my mother. He complimented her constantly. He was in awe, as many of us are, of her social skills. He could not tell us or her often enough how wonderful she was. So genuine and so heartfelt. He truly adored her. I will never forget the evening when my mother received an award for the work that she did, setting up a leadership program through the Chamber of Commerce in Annapolis, Maryland. A dinner was held in her honor. Jim, quite literally, could not contain his pride. It was an incredibly heartwarming thing to witness. And it was always such a comfort to me knowing how deeply he loved my mother. Jim was my mother's champion and she his. They brought a balance to one another's lives, and they brought out the best in one another. They showed a very special companionship, a companionship to be admired, and a companionship to inspire to. I spoke to Jim a week before his passing. He was very weak, and I struggled to understand him. At the end of our conversation, he said, "You girls have been great, and you have a wonderful mother." I thanked him and told him that I loved him, and I sincerely meant it. He said, "You know, Polly, it has been a great ride." At that moment, I knew he was saying goodbye. When I hung up the phone, I knew that it was the last time I was to hear his voice. Jim Wilson did have a great ride. How grateful and blessed are we to have been a part of Jim's great ride.
Is correct. As a friend, Nancy, again, thank you for all you did for him. Nobody could ever have done better. Jim and I played a lot of golf together and had a great time. The final time was about 2 years ago, over the holidays, and he seemed a picture of health. But afterwards, he asked me about this back pain he had. We played a lot of golf together in tournaments. It was just a few years ago, we actually led the Yugoslav tournament here on the coast. After the first day, I think we shot 9 under par. And probably the highlight of either of ours golf life. But honestly, golf isn't the reason Jim was my friend. After the hurricane, Jim and Nancy came to stay with us for a few days or a week or two. It was a lot of fun, and it passed quickly. Mary and I got to see some really tough and resilient people in action. It was kind of amusing when boxes of clothes from $6 all over the country, all fitting perfectly, showed up for Nancy. And Jim was left pretty much on his own, but I told him, the highest compliment you can pay somebody sometimes is to assume that they'll be all right. In any case, through hurricanes and golf, you spend a lot of time together, hours, hundreds of hours, maybe thousands, and you can do a lot of talking. And the amazing thing to me about Jim was how he and I, with completely different backgrounds and completely different thought processes, so often came to the same conclusions about things. If the subject was healthcare, he would cite statistics and I would cite personal experience, and yet we somehow agreed. He liked to quote the New Republic, and I liked to quote the Bible, and yet somehow we agreed. Learn to do right, seek justice, oppose the ruthless, plead for the widow. The first time I quoted these admonitions from the prophet Isaiah to Jim, he was really tickled. He was used to people quoting the Bible against him, not for him. And somehow those words came to mind because they described Jim. And through the pain of bone cancer and the worst case of shingles you ever saw, nothing helped. And the helplessness of Parkinson's disease, right down to the final bitter decision that enough was enough. That describes Jim. He never lost his sense of the welfare of others ahead of his own. Some people who have a religious upbringing reject the dogma, the rituals thereof, but nevertheless live out the spirit and values of that religion far better than those who go through the motions of belief. And that is the reason Jim Wilson